Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had been labeled a problem employee by her supervisors at Riverside Manufacturing for what they called excessive attention to safety protocols and an inability to stay in her lane. 18 months later, those same meticulous instincts and combat-tested leadership skills would be the only things standing between 400 workers and an industrial explosion that would have been the deadliest workplace disaster in American history. The harsh fluorescent lights of Building D cast long shadows across Maria's weathered hands as she guided her equipment cart through the sprawling corridors of Riverside Manufacturing's main production facility. Her navy blue uniform marked her as just another member of the plant's maintenance crew, invisible to the engineers and supervisors who hurried past her each morning. To them, she was simply part of the machinery that kept their operations running smoothly, someone who fixed broken equipment and cleaned up after their shifts ended. They had no idea that the woman adjusting valve pressures and checking safety systems had once led a squad of Marines through the most dangerous territories in Afghanistan, earning decorations that most military personnel never even see. Maria moved through the facility with a precision that seemed excessive for someone whose job involved routine equipment maintenance and facility upkeep. While her colleagues discussed weekend plans and complained about overtime schedules, Maria's eyes constantly scanned pressure gauges, monitored temperature readings, and tracked the subtle vibrations that indicated how machinery was performing under stress. She understood that industrial operations were a delicate balance between efficiency and catastrophe, where the smallest oversight could cascade into tragedy that claimed dozens of lives in seconds. "Santos, you're doing it again," called out Frank Morrison, her direct supervisor, as he approached with his usual mixture of irritation and bewilderment. "You're supposed to be lubricating conveyor systems, not conducting engineering inspections. We have certified technicians for that kind of work." Maria didn't look up from her tablet where she was noting pressure differentials in the chemical processing lines that fed into the main production floor. "Line 7 is running hot," she muttered, more to herself than to Morrison. "Those pressure readings are approaching critical thresholds for the adhesive compounds they're processing today." Morrison followed her gaze to a control panel that displayed readings he couldn't interpret even after 15 years of supervisory experience. "How can you possibly know what those numbers mean? And since when does a maintenance worker concern herself with chemical processing parameters?" Maria finally looked up from her calculations, her dark eyes holding an intensity that seemed incongruous with her mundane work uniform. "Since chemistry doesn't care about job descriptions," she replied. "That line is processing methyl ethyl ketone peroxide with stabilizers that break down at temperatures above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. We're currently at 138 degrees and climbing." Sure enough, 20 minutes later, the automated safety systems triggered an emergency shutdown of Line 7 as temperature sensors detected conditions that could have led to thermal runaway in the chemical mixing process. The production supervisor would later report that the early warning had prevented what could have been a significant safety incident. But Morrison never made the connection between Maria's observation and the system failure that followed. The other members of the maintenance crew had developed their own theories about Maria Santos over the 18 months she had worked at Riverside Manufacturing. Some thought she was a former factory supervisor who had been demoted due to workplace conflicts. Others speculated that she was an engineering school dropout who compensated for her lack of formal education by overanalyzing routine maintenance tasks. The more creative rumors suggested she was related to plant management and was working her way up through the ranks to understand operations from the ground level. What none of them suspected was that she had voluntarily walked away from a distinguished military career because she couldn't reconcile the gap between the leadership principles that had kept her Marines alive in combat and the corporate culture that prioritized productivity metrics over worker safety. Maria's workstation in the maintenance facility was organized with military precision that contrasted sharply with the casual chaos that characterized her colleagues' work areas. While others decorated their lockers with family photos and sports memorabilia, Maria's space contained technical manuals, safety protocol charts, and industrial process diagrams that looked more like military intelligence briefings than anything. Related to routine facility maintenance, she had acquired these materials through careful study and professional connections that dated back to her military service, building a comprehensive understanding of industrial safety that exceeded the knowledge of most plant supervisors. Her colleagues had noticed her obsessive attention to detail during her first week on the job, when she had systematically cataloged every safety system in the facility and identified 17 potential failure points that weren't covered by existing inspection protocols. The robot had become her unofficial nickname among the maintenance crew, a reference to her methodical approach to every task and her apparent inability to engage in casual conversation or workplace social activities. She arrived before her shift began, performed her assigned duties with exhaustive thoroughness, and spent her break period studying incident reports from similar manufacturing facilities across the country. Her colleagues assumed she was either incredibly dedicated to a job that most people considered routine and unrewarding, or that she was compensating for some perceived inadequacy by working harder than necessary. What they didn't understand was that Maria's meticulous attention to detail stemmed from hard-earned knowledge that safety systems were only as reliable as the people who maintained them, and that the difference between normal operations and catastrophic failure was often measured in degrees of temperature, pounds of pressure, or seconds of response time. Her approach to industrial safety had been shaped by experiences where inattention to detail resulted in casualties that couldn't be undone, where leadership meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that affected every person under your command. Her military training had instilled a bone-deep understanding that complex systems failed in predictable patterns, that warning signs were visible to those who knew how to interpret them, and that preventing disaster required the courage to speak uncomfortable truths to authority figures who preferred reassuring reports to accurate assessments. The same analytical mindset that had kept her Marines alive during multiple combat deployments now compelled her to notice pressure anomalies, temperature variations, and equipment stress patterns that indicated potential system failures. Maria's apartment told a story that none of her co-workers could have imagined. Hidden behind the modest exterior of a maintenance worker's residence was a shrine to military excellence that documented one of the most distinguished service records in recent Marine Corps' history. The walls displayed commendations that represented years of leadership under the most challenging conditions imaginable, including campaign ribbons from 3 different combat deployments and qualification badges that indicated mastery of specialized skills that only a small percentage of military personnel ever develop. The centerpiece of her display was a framed citation that accompanied the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The citation described actions during Operation Enduring Freedom when Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had single-handedly defended a forward operating base against a coordinated enemy assault, personally accounting for the elimination of multiple hostile positions while coordinating medical evacuation for wounded Marines. Under intense enemy fire, the photograph beside the citation showed a younger Maria in dress blue uniform, her bearing reflecting the confidence of someone who had earned the respect of her peers through demonstrated competence under extreme pressure. The woman in that photograph stood with perfect military posture, her decorations representing a level of courage and leadership that existed at the intersection of tactical brilliance and moral courage. She had been selected for advanced leadership training programs that prepared Marines for the most challenging assignments in hostile environments. Maria's service record documented a career that spanned multiple specialties within the Marine Corps, including advanced explosive ordnance disposal, chemical weapons defense, and industrial facility security. Her assignments had included protecting critical infrastructure in combat zones, where she had developed expertise in recognizing sabotage attempts and preventing attacks on facilities that provided essential services to military operations and civilian populations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Her specialty had been threat assessment and protective operations for high-value installations, missions that required instant recognition of danger signs and the ability to coordinate complex defensive measures while maintaining normal operations. The skills that made her exceptional in military service were precisely the abilities that allowed her to recognize industrial safety hazards that escaped the attention of personnel who had never operated in environments where mistakes had immediate and fatal consequences. The turning point in her military career was documented in classified after-action reports that Maria kept in a secured file cabinet beside her bed. Operation Steel Guardian had been a routine security assignment designed to protect a forward logistics base that supplied multiple combat outposts throughout the region. Maria had been selected as the non-commissioned officer in charge of facility security based on her exceptional performance ratings and her reputation for identifying threats before they materialized into actual attacks 3 days before a major supply convoy was scheduled to depart. Maria had identified suspicious patterns in local civilian activity that suggested preparation for a coordinated assault on the base. Her analysis indicated that enemy forces were conducting surveillance and positioning resources for an attack timed to coincide with the convoy's departure, when the base would be most vulnerable due to reduced security personnel and the concentration of valuable supplies in staging areas. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson, had dismissed her concerns as excessive caution based on incomplete intelligence. The threat assessment from higher headquarters indicated minimal enemy activity in the area, and the convoy departure schedule had been coordinated with multiple units whose operations would be disrupted by delays. Maria was ordered to maintain normal security protocols and focus on her assigned duties rather than pursuing speculative threat scenarios that lacked supporting evidence from official intelligence sources. Maria had requested permission to implement enhanced security measures and conduct additional reconnaissance to verify her assessment. When that request was denied, she had documented her concerns in writing and requested that they be forwarded to the intelligence section for evaluation. Colonel Patterson had interpreted this as insubordination and issued a direct order for Maria to concentrate on routine security operations rather than second-guessing assessments made by officers with access to classified intelligence that she did not possess. The attack had come exactly as Maria had predicted, a coordinated assault involving multiple enemy positions that targeted the base's most vulnerable points during the convoy preparation period. The enemy had demonstrated detailed knowledge of the facility's layout and defensive capabilities, confirming that they had conducted the surveillance that Maria had identified, but which higher command had dismissed as normal civilian activity. Maria's defensive preparations, implemented despite official orders to maintain routine security posture, had prevented the attack from achieving its objectives. Her early warning systems had detected the initial assault elements, allowing base personnel to respond before the enemy could establish positions within the facility perimeter. The ammunition and fuel supplies that represented the primary targets of the attack had been secured in locations that Maria had designated based on her threat assessment. During the 6-hour battle that followed, Maria had personally directed defensive operations while coordinating medical evacuation for wounded personnel and ensuring that critical supplies remained protected from enemy fire. Her actions had prevented the loss of resources that would have compromised multiple ongoing operations and resulted in strategic advantages for enemy forces throughout the region. The official investigation had credited Maria's exceptional leadership, with preventing a significant military disaster, and her Medal of Honor citation, specifically mentioned her ability to recognize and respond to threats that had escaped detection by conventional intelligence assessment methods. However, her relationship with the chain of command had been permanently altered by her willingness to challenge official threat assessments and implement unauthorized security measures. Colonel Patterson and other senior officers viewed her as a non-commissioned officer who prioritized personal judgment over military discipline and proper command authority. While they acknowledged her tactical competence, they considered her unsuitable for positions that required unquestioning execution of orders established by superior officers with broader strategic responsibilities. Maria's final military evaluation had described her as tactically brilliant but incompatible with command structures that required trust and hierarchical decision-making processes. The report recommended that she be considered for specialized assignments that utilized her technical expertise while minimizing her involvement in situations where adherence to established command protocols was essential for mission success, rather than accept assignments that would have utilized her skills while constraining her ability to act on professional judgment. Maria had chosen to complete her enlistment and transition to civilian employment. She had walked away from a military career that represented 12 years of distinguished service and exceptional achievement, choosing uncertainty over the gradual erosion of the principles that had made her an effective leader. Now 18 months later, she maintained industrial equipment and cleaned production facilities while watching supervisors make decisions that she knew could be improved with better analysis and more attention to safety factors that existed outside standard operating procedures. The irony was not lost on her that the same situational awareness and refusal to accept reassuring but inaccurate assessments that had saved lives in combat now marked her as a difficult employee who couldn't understand the boundaries of her civilian responsibilities. Maria's daily routine reflected military discipline adapted to civilian industrial operations. She arrived at the facility before her shift officially began, conducted systematic inspections that exceeded her job requirements, and spent her break period studying technical documentation that helped her understand the complex interactions between different manufacturing processes. She observed every aspect of facility operations with the attention of someone who understood that industrial accidents were often the result of multiple small failures that, combined in catastrophic ways. Her colleagues interpreted her behavior as either exceptional dedication to a routine job or obsessive perfectionism that indicated underlying psychological issues. What they couldn't understand was that Maria's approach to industrial safety was grounded in military experience, where lives depended on accurate threat assessment and proactive risk mitigation, where leadership meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that extended far beyond individual performance metrics. Maria's first encounter with what she recognized as a serious safety hazard occurred during her second month at Riverside Manufacturing, when she noticed unusual corrosion patterns on the primary chemical storage tanks that supplied the adhesive production lines. The stainless steel surfaces showed signs of stress corrosion cracking that indicated exposure to chloride compounds at elevated temperatures, a combination that could lead to catastrophic tank failure if the degradation continued unchecked. Approached Kevin Walsh, the senior chemical engineer responsible for tank maintenance, with her observations and a recommendation for immediate metallurgical testing. Walsh examined the areas Maria had identified, but dismissed her concerns as normal wear patterns that were well within acceptable parameters for industrial storage equipment. Santos, these tanks are inspected quarterly by certified technicians, he explained with the patience of someone addressing a child. The corrosion you're seeing is superficial oxidation that's completely normal for equipment that's been in service for 8 years. Maria persisted, explaining that the crack patterns she had observed were consistent with stress corrosion failure modes that could progress rapidly under certain chemical and temperature conditions. She had documented the precise locations and orientations of the cracks, along with measurements that indicated the degradation was following grain boundaries in the steel, rather than occurring randomly across the surface. Walsh's response made it clear that he considered her analysis to be the uninformed speculation of someone who had confused normal equipment aging with actual structural problems. 3 weeks later, Tank 7 developed a hairline crack that released approximately 50 gallons of methyl ethyl ketone peroxide onto the production floor before automatic sensors detected the leak and triggered emergency shutdown procedures. The incident resulted in a 12-hour production delay while hazardous. Materials crews cleaned up the spill and conducted air quality testing to ensure worker safety. Walsh never acknowledged that Maria's earlier warning had identified the exact failure mode that occurred, and the incident report attributed the tank failure to normal equipment wear that could not have been predicted through routine inspection procedures. The pattern of accurate predictions followed by official dismissal became a defining characteristic of Maria's experience at Riverside Manufacturing. When she identified vibration patterns in the main air compressor system that indicated bearing were approaching critical failure thresholds, the mechanical maintenance supervisor told her that compression equipment was serviced according to manufacturer specifications and didn't require monitoring by maintenance personnel. When she warned that the electrical panel serving Building C was showing signs of thermal stress that could lead to equipment failure during peak load conditions, the plant electrician explained that electrical systems were maintained by licensed professionals who understood power distribution better than someone whose job involved mopping floors and checking fluid levels. Each incident followed the same progression. Maria would identify a potential safety hazard through careful observation and technical analysis, report her findings to the appropriate supervisor, receive a polite but firm explanation of why her concerns were unfounded, and then watch as events unfolded exactly as she had predicted. The air compressor failed during a peak production period, causing a facility-wide shutdown that lasted 6 hours while emergency repairs were completed. The electrical panel overheated during summer peak load conditions, triggering automatic safety systems that reduced power to critical production equipment and resulted in significant product losses. Maria's colleagues had begun to notice her uncanny ability to predict equipment failures, but they attributed her success to luck rather than expertise. Santos has some kind of weird intuition about machines, observed Linda Chen, a quality control technician who had worked at the facility for 12 years. She always seems to know when something's going to break down, but she explains it with all this technical jargon that makes it sound more complicated than it really is. The nickname Cassandra began circulating among the maintenance crew, a reference to Maria's habit of making dire predictions that initially seemed overblown, but consistently proved accurate. Her supervisor, Frank Morrison, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Maria's pattern of identifying problems that exceeded her official job responsibilities. During her 6-month performance review, he had written that she demonstrated excessive concern with operational issues beyond her scope of authority and recommended that she focus on assigned maintenance tasks rather than attempting to perform engineering analysis. Maria had signed the evaluation without comment, recognizing that defending her actions would only reinforce Morrison's perception that she was a difficult employee who couldn't accept appropriate boundaries. She had learned that expertise without institutional credentials was often interpreted as presumption, and that being consistently correct about technical matters could actually damage her standing with supervisors who viewed her warnings as implicit criticism of their competence. The most frustrating aspect of her situation was the knowledge that her military experience had prepared her to recognize exactly the types of systemic failures that pose the greatest risks to industrial facilities. During her deployments, she had been responsible for maintaining forward operating bases where equipment failure could compromise mission success and endanger personnel. She had developed expertise in rapid failure analysis, predictive maintenance, and emergency response coordination that directly applied to civilian industrial operations. Her training in explosive ordnance disposal had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that indicated unstable chemical reactions, knowledge that was directly relevant to the adhesive manufacturing processes that represented the core of Riverside's business operations. Her experience with facility security had provided insights into how seemingly minor system failures could cascade into major emergencies if proper safeguards weren't in place. Her leadership experience had instilled an understanding that preventing disasters required constant vigilance and the willingness to act on incomplete information when the potential consequences of inaction were unacceptable. But none of this experience mattered in a corporate environment where technical decisions were made by personnel with engineering degrees and professional certifications, regardless of whether their academic training included practical experience with the specific failure modes that Maria had encountered in military service. Her warnings were consistently dismissed not because they were inaccurate, but because they came from someone whose position in the organizational hierarchy didn't carry the authority necessary to challenge technical assessments made by her supervisors. Breaking point in Maria's relationship with plant management came during a routine safety meeting when she attempted to raise concerns about the chemical mixing procedures used in Building D's main production area. She had observed that operators were combining certain adhesive components at temperatures and concentrations that created conditions similar to those she had encountered with improvised explosive devices during her military service. The chemical reactions involved were fundamentally similar, and Maria recognized that the safety margins being used were inadequate for the quantities of material being processed. Plant manager Robert Hendricks listened to Maria's presentation with visible impatience, then cut her off with a gesture that indicated the discussion was over. "Ms. Santos, I appreciate your enthusiasm for safety protocols," he said, choosing his words with deliberate precision. "However, our manufacturing processes have been developed by chemical engineers with advanced degrees and decades of industry experience. These procedures are based on extensive testing and are regularly reviewed by regulatory agencies. I don't think it's appropriate for maintenance personnel to question processes that are handled by qualified professionals." Maria attempted to explain that her military experience had included training in chemical weapons defense and industrial facility protection, areas of expertise that were directly relevant to the safety concerns she was raising. Hendricks interrupted her again, this time with obvious irritation. "Your military background is noted in your personnel file, but this is a civilian manufacturing facility, not a combat zone. Military experience doesn't translate to industrial chemical processes, and I need you to understand that your job responsibilities don't include process engineering or safety analysis." The meeting ended with Hendricks issuing a formal directive that maintenance personnel were to limit their observations and recommendations to equipment directly related to their assigned duties. Any concerns about production processes, chemical handling, or facility safety systems were to be reported to immediate supervisors who would determine whether they warranted investigation by qualified technical personnel. Maria was specifically cautioned against conducting unauthorized analysis of manufacturing operations or presenting technical assessments that exceeded her area of responsibility. Following the safety meeting, Maria found herself increasingly isolated from her colleagues, who had witnessed her public reprimand and understood that associating with her could affect their own standing with management. Morrison began assigning her to tasks that minimized her contact with critical production systems, restricting her duties to routine cleaning and basic maintenance that didn't require technical judgment or safety analysis. She was effectively being punished for demonstrating expertise that threatened the authority structure of the organization. The irony of her situation was particularly bitter because Maria's military service had been defined by environments where Expertise was valued regardless of its source, where life or death decisions were made based on the best available information rather than the formal credentials of the person providing it. In combat, a private who noticed signs of an improvised explosive device received the same attention as an officer reporting intelligence from classified sources. Survival depended on recognizing and acting on accurate information, not on maintaining hierarchical protocols that could delay critical responses. Her transition to civilian employment had revealed a fundamental difference in how organizations approached risk management and decision-making authority. The corporate structure at Riverside Manufacturing prioritized orderly procedures and clear chains of command over rapid response to emerging threats. Employees were expected to operate within clearly defined roles, and stepping outside those boundaries was interpreted as insubordination rather than initiative. Maria's military training had emphasized adaptability and cross-functional competence, preparing personnel to assume responsibilities beyond their primary specialties when situations demanded it. Leaders were expected to make decisions based on their assessment of conditions on the ground, even when those assessments conflicted with guidance from higher headquarters. The mission took precedence over protocol, and individuals were held accountable for results rather than compliance with procedures. The civilian workplace operated according to different principles that emphasized stability and predictability over flexibility and rapid adaptation. Roles were clearly defined, decision-making authority was centralized, and deviation from established procedures was discouraged. Employees were evaluated based on their ability to perform assigned tasks according to specified standards, not on their capacity to recognize and respond to unexpected challenges. Maria's attempts to apply military leadership principles to civilian industrial operations had consistently resulted in conflict with supervisors, who viewed her behavior as evidence that she didn't understand corporate culture or respect organizational boundaries. Her proactive approach to problem-solving was interpreted as overreach, and her willingness to challenge technical assessments was seen as arrogance rather than professional competence. She had begun to understand that her military experience, rather than being an asset in civilian employment, had actually become a liability that marked her as someone who couldn't adapt to corporate environments that required different skills and attitudes. The same qualities that had made her an exceptional military leader were now preventing her from succeeding in a workplace that valued compliance over competence and stability over excellence. Her growing isolation at Riverside Manufacturing was compounded by the knowledge that she possessed technical expertise that could significantly improve facility safety and operational efficiency, but that sharing this knowledge only resulted in professional damage and increased scrutiny from management. She had learned to remain silent when she observed potential problems, understanding that speaking up would be interpreted as insubordination rather than dedication to worker safety. The transformation from respected military leader to marginalized maintenance worker had been psychologically devastating in ways that Maria had not anticipated when she decided to transition to civilian employment. Her identity had been built around technical competence and leadership responsibility, and the systematic dismissal of her expertise had undermined her sense of professional worth and personal effectiveness. She found herself questioning whether her military experience had been as valuable as she had believed, whether her technical training had been less comprehensive than she had assumed, and whether her leadership skills were actually applicable outside the specific context of military operations. The consistent pattern of accurate predictions followed by official dismissal had created doubt about her own judgment and the value of her professional knowledge. Her evening routine now included reviewing technical journals and industry publications, searching for validation that her assessments of facility hazards were based on sound engineering principles rather than misguided assumptions. She had begun to document her observations in personal files, creating detailed records of potential safety issues that she had identified. but couldn't report through official channels without risking further conflict with management. The documentation served multiple purposes. It provided evidence that her technical analysis was methodical and well-founded. It created a record of problems that might eventually require attention regardless of their current dismissal by supervisory personnel. And it maintained her connection to the analytical skills that had defined her military career. The process of systematic observation and technical assessment helped preserve her sense of professional identity, even when that identity was being systematically devalued by her civilian employment. Maria's apartment had become a research center, where she studied industrial safety incidents from similar facilities, analyzing the failure modes and warning signs that preceded major accidents. She had identified patterns in equipment degradation, chemical process instability, and human factors that consistently appeared in incident reports from manufacturing facilities across the country. Her analysis confirmed that the hazards she had identified at Riverside Manufacturing were real and significant, even though her warnings had been dismissed by plant management. The knowledge that she was correct about the technical risks didn't provide satisfaction or vindication, because she understood that being right about potential disasters was meaningless if she lacked the authority or credibility necessary to prevent them from occurring. Her expertise had become a source of frustration rather than professional fulfillment, and her awareness of safety hazards had transformed from an asset into a burden that she carried in isolation. The third major incident that would define Maria's reputation as a perpetual alarmist occurred during the peak summer production season, when Riverside Manufacturing was operating at maximum capacity to meet seasonal demand for their industrial adhesives. The facility was running 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week, pushing every system to its operational limits while maintaining the aggressive production schedules that corporate headquarters had mandated to capture market share during the busy construction season. Maria had been monitoring the cooling system that served Building D's chemical processing area, noting that the chiller units were struggling to maintain adequate temperatures as ambient heat combined with increased production loads to create thermal stress throughout the facility. The cooling system was designed with sufficient capacity for normal operations, but the sustained high demand period was revealing design limitations that became critical when multiple variables aligned unfavorably. She documented temperature readings from various points throughout the cooling circuit, identifying specific locations where heat exchangers were operating beyond their optimal efficiency ranges and coolant flow rates were insufficient to maintain stable temperatures in the chemical storage areas. Her analysis indicated that the system was approaching a threshold where thermal runaway could occur in certain chemical processes, particularly those involving peroxide-based compounds that became increasingly unstable at elevated temperatures. Maria prepared a comprehensive report that included temperature trend analysis, cooling system performance data, and specific recommendations for temporary modifications that could improve thermal management during the peak demand period. She identified several low-cost interventions that could be implemented immediately, including revised production scheduling that would distribute thermal loads more evenly throughout the facility and supplemental cooling measures for critical chemical storage areas. Her report was submitted to Dale Thompson, the facility's engineering manager, who was responsible for maintaining environmental controls throughout the manufacturing complex. Thompson reviewed her documentation with the skeptical attention of someone who had spent 15 years managing industrial cooling systems and didn't appreciate receiving technical advice from maintenance personnel who lacked formal engineering education. "Santos, this is incredibly detailed work, but I think you're overcomplicating what are essentially normal seasonal variations in system performance," Thompson explained during their brief meeting. "Our cooling systems are designed with appropriate safety margins, and we monitor all critical parameters through automated control systems. If there were any real problems, our instrumentation would alert us immediately. Maria attempted to explain that her analysis had identified conditions where automated monitoring systems might not detect gradual degradation until critical thresholds were exceeded. But Thompson dismissed her concerns with the confidence of someone who trusted technological solutions over human observation. The meeting ended with Thompson assuring her that facilities engineering would keep an eye on things while continuing to operate the cooling systems according to manufacturer specifications and established protocols. 2 weeks later, during a particularly hot afternoon when outside temperatures exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the primary chiller serving Building D experienced a cascade failure that began with thermal overload in the main compressor and rapidly spread throughout the cooling circuit. The failure occurred exactly as Maria's analysis had predicted. During peak afternoon heat when production demands were highest and the cooling system was operating with minimal reserve capacity, the loss of cooling triggered automatic shutdown procedures for several chemical processing lines, but not before temperatures in storage area 7 exceeded safe limits for methyl ethyl ketone peroxide compounds. The chemical storage tanks had to be emergency cooled using portable units while hazardous materials specialists conducted safety assessments to ensure that thermal exposure hadn't compromised the stability of stored compounds. The incident resulted in a complete shutdown of Building D for 18 hours, while cooling systems were repaired and chemical inventories were tested for thermal damage. Production losses exceeded $400,000, and the emergency response required coordination with local fire departments and environmental agencies to ensure that no hazardous materials had been released into the surrounding community. Dale Thompson never acknowledged that Maria's earlier warning had identified the exact failure mode and timeline that led to the cooling system collapse. The incident report attributed the failure to unprecedented weather conditions combined with peak operational demands and recommended enhanced monitoring systems that would provide earlier warning of similar problems in the future. No mention was made of the detailed analysis that had been submitted weeks earlier by a maintenance worker, whose technical assessment had proven completely accurate. Maria's colleagues had begun to notice the disturbing pattern of her predictions being consistently validated by subsequent events, but their recognition created additional isolation rather than respect for her technical expertise. "She's like some kind of fortune teller, but for industrial accidents," muttered Carlos Rodriguez, a maintenance technician who had worked alongside Maria for several months. "Every time she says something bad is going to happen, it happens exactly the way she described it. It's getting kind of creepy." The perception that Maria possessed some kind of supernatural ability to predict equipment failures had become more comfortable for her colleagues than acknowledging that her technical knowledge might exceed that of their supervisors. Treating her accurate assessments as mysterious intuition rather than professional competence allowed them to maintain confidence in the organizational hierarchy while explaining away the obvious disconnect between her warnings and management's dismissive responses. Frank Morrison had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the attention that Maria's predictions were generating among the maintenance crew. During their regular supervisory meetings, other department heads had begun asking about the maintenance worker who seemed to know more about facility operations than most of the engineering staff. Morrison found himself in the awkward position of defending management decisions while privately acknowledging that Maria's technical assessments had proven remarkably accurate. His solution was to further restrict Maria's access to critical systems and limit her duties to tasks that minimized her opportunity to observe potential problems. She was reassigned to exterior building maintenance, parking lot cleaning, and other responsibilities that kept her away from production areas where her observations might identify safety concerns that would require official responses from engineering personnel. The reassignment was presented as a rotation designed to provide Maria with broader experience in facility maintenance but she understood that it was actually punishment for demonstrating expertise that threatened the competence of her supervisors. Her new duties kept her physically separated from the chemical processing equipment and cooling systems, where her military training was most applicable, effectively neutralizing her ability to identify safety hazards before they developed into operational crises. Maria's isolation from critical facility systems didn't prevent her from continuing to monitor conditions that could affect worker safety, but it required her to be more creative in gathering the technical information necessary for accurate threat assessment. She began arriving at work earlier to conduct unofficial inspections during shift changes when production areas were less heavily supervised, and she used her break periods to review system status displays that were visible from public areas of the facility. Her informal monitoring revealed that the problems she had identified were continuing to develop according to the pattern she had predicted, but her physical separation from critical systems made it impossible for her to gather the detailed data necessary to support formal warnings. She was reduced to observing symptoms of systemic problems without having access to the diagnostic information that would allow her to quantify risks or recommend specific corrective actions. The psychological impact of her professional marginalization had become more severe than Maria had anticipated when she first encountered resistance to her technical assessments. Her military experience had prepared her for physical danger, complex logistics, and high-stress decision-making, but it hadn't equipped her to handle the systematic dismissal of her professional competence by people whose qualifications were inferior to her own. The constant cycle of accurate predictions, followed by official denial, had created a form of professional gaslighting that undermined her confidence in her own technical judgment. She found herself questioning assessments that she knew were based on sound engineering principles, wondering whether her military experience had somehow distorted her understanding of civilian industrial operations, and doubting whether her training was actually applicable to the challenges she observed at Riverside Manufacturing. Her evening routine had expanded to include extensive research into industrial safety standards, equipment manufacturer specifications, and regulatory requirements that governed chemical processing operations. She was searching for external validation that her technical concerns were legitimate, but the research process had become an obsessive attempt to prove to herself that her professional knowledge remained valid despite its consistent rejection by workplace supervisors. The documentation she maintained in her apartment had grown into a comprehensive analysis of Riverside Manufacturing's operational vulnerabilities, complete with failure mode analysis, risk assessment matrices, and detailed recommendations for improving safety protocols. The reports represented hundreds of hours of work that had no official value because they came from someone whose position in the organizational hierarchy didn't carry the authority necessary to influence policy decisions. Maria's personal library had expanded to include technical journals, industry publications, and government safety bulletins that kept her current with developments in industrial safety management and chemical process engineering. She had maintained professional certifications that weren't required for her maintenance position, attending training programs and workshops that she paid for with her own money because her employer didn't consider them relevant to her job responsibilities. Continuing education served multiple purposes beyond maintaining her technical knowledge. It provided contact with other safety professionals who recognized her expertise and didn't dismiss her assessments based on her current job title. These interactions helped preserve her sense of professional identity and provided confirmation that her technical skills remained current and applicable to industrial safety challenges. She had begun networking with military veterans who had transitioned to civilian industrial careers, discovering that many of them had encountered similar challenges in having their technical expertise recognized and valued by corporate employers. The conversations revealed patterns of institutional bias that systematically undervalued military experience and created Barriers to career advancement for veterans whose qualifications didn't fit traditional civilian credential requirements. Veteran Support Network had become an essential source of psychological stability for Maria, providing a professional community where her military experience was understood and respected rather than viewed as irrelevant to civilian workplace. Challenges. Through these connections, she had learned about other manufacturing facilities where military veterans had successfully transitioned to engineering and management positions that utilized their technical training and leadership experience. However, the knowledge that successful transitions were possible made her current situation more frustrating rather than more hopeful. She understood that her professional marginalization at Riverside Manufacturing was not inevitable, but was the result of specific organizational dynamics that prevented her expertise from being recognized and utilized effectively. Other companies had created pathways for military veterans to contribute their specialized knowledge to civilian operations, but Riverside's corporate culture actively discouraged the kind of cross-functional expertise that Maria represented. Her attempts to transfer to other positions within the company had been consistently blocked by Frank Morrison, who cited her tendency to exceed assigned responsibilities as evidence that she wasn't ready for advancement to roles that required greater independence and technical judgment. The performance evaluations that Morrison had written created a documented pattern of criticism that would follow Maria to any other position within the organization, effectively trapping her in maintenance duties regardless of her actual qualifications. The realization that her military service record, which represented 12 years of exceptional performance and distinguished achievement, had become a liability rather than an asset in civilian employment, had been psychologically devastating. She had expected that transitioning to civilian work would require learning new skills and adapting to different organizational cultures, but she hadn't anticipated that her core competencies would be viewed as problematic rather than valuable. Her sense of professional identity had been built around technical excellence and leadership responsibility, and the systematic dismissal of these qualities by civilian supervisors had created a crisis of confidence that extended beyond workplace performance to fundamental questions about her personal worth and future prospects. The woman who had earned the Medal of Honor for exceptional courage and leadership now found herself doubting whether she possessed any skills that were valued in civilian society. The disparity between her military achievements and her civilian employment status had become a source of internal conflict that affected every aspect of her life. She struggled with the cognitive dissonance of knowing that she was capable of extraordinary performance while being treated as a marginally competent employee whose opinions weren't worth considering. The disconnect between her actual abilities and her perceived value had created psychological stress that she was managing through increased isolation and obsessive focus on technical study. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maria's social life had contracted to virtually nothing as she withdrew from activities and relationships that reminded her of the gap between her military accomplishments and her current circumstances. She declined invitations from coworkers because social interactions inevitably led to questions about her background that were difficult to answer honestly without revealing the full extent of her qualifications. The explanations that her military service had included technical specialties relevant to industrial operations only led to more questions about why she was working in maintenance rather than engineering or management positions. Her family had grown concerned about her increasing isolation and apparent depression, but Maria found it impossible to explain the psychological impact of professional marginalization to people who hadn't experienced similar circumstances. Her parents were proud of her military service and didn't understand why civilian employment was proving so challenging for someone with her accomplishments. Her siblings suggested that she was being too perfectionist in her approach to a job that was meant to be temporary while she pursued other opportunities. The suggestion that she should simply accept her current position as a stepping stone to better opportunities ignored the reality that her performance evaluations were creating a documented record of problems that would prevent advancement within Riverside Manufacturing and might affect her prospects with other employers. She was trapped in a cycle where demonstrating her actual capabilities led to criticism for exceeding her assigned role, while limiting herself to basic maintenance. Duties confirmed the perception that she lacked the qualifications for more responsible positions. The catalyst that would transform Maria's professional exile into a life or death crisis began on a sweltering Tuesday morning in late August when Riverside Manufacturing received its largest order in company history. TechCorp Industries had contracted for an emergency production run of specialized industrial adhesives needed for a critical infrastructure project, requiring the facility to operate at 110% of normal capacity for 6 consecutive weeks to meet an accelerated delivery SCHEUL that carried massive penalty clauses for any delays. Plant manager Robert Hendricks had accepted the contract despite warnings from his engineering staff that sustained overproduction would stress every system in the facility beyond design specifications. The financial incentives were too substantial to decline, and corporate headquarters had made it clear that capturing this contract was essential for the company's expansion plans and quarterly profit targets. The decision represented exactly the kind of risk versus reward calculation that prioritized short-term financial gains over long-term operational stability. The emergency production schedule required round-the-clock operations with minimal downtime for routine maintenance and system inspections. Equipment that normally received daily monitoring would be checked only during brief shift changes, and preventive maintenance procedures that required production shutdowns were postponed until after the contract completion. Maria recognized that these operational changes were creating exactly the conditions that led to cascade failures in complex industrial systems. She had attempted to express her concerns about the accelerated production schedule during a brief all-hands meeting, but Hendricks had cut her off before she could articulate her technical assessment. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity our company needs to establish market leadership," he announced to the assembled workforce. "Everyone needs to focus on their assigned responsibilities and trust that management has considered all relevant factors in accepting this contract." The rebuke was delivered with sufficient force to ensure that no other employees would raise questions about the operational risks associated with the emergency production schedule. Maria understood that any further attempts to voice her concerns would be interpreted as insubordination and could result in disciplinary action that would provide justification for her termination. She was forced to watch in silence as the facility implemented operating procedures that she knew were creating conditions for disaster. The first signs of systemic stress appeared within 72 hours of the emergency production schedule implementation. Equipment that had been operating reliably under normal conditions began showing symptoms of thermal and mechanical stress as sustained. High-demand operations pushed every component toward its maximum tolerance levels. Maria observed pressure fluctuations in the chemical processing lines, temperature variations in the cooling systems, and vibration patterns in rotating equipment that indicated accelerated wear and potential failure modes. Her restricted access to critical production areas made it impossible to gather detailed diagnostic data, but the symptoms she could observe from peripheral locations were consistent with the failure progression patterns she had studied in military infrastructure protection training. The facility was approaching a critical threshold where multiple system failures could occur simultaneously, creating emergency conditions that would overwhelm the capacity of safety systems designed to handle individual equipment malfunctions. Maria began documenting her observations in detailed incident reports that she submitted to Frank Morrison, requesting that they be forwarded to engineering personnel for evaluation. Morrison's responses indicated that her concerns were being dismissed as the predictable anxiety of someone who didn't understand the robust safety margins built into industrial equipment. The engineers who reviewed her reports concluded that the symptoms she described were within normal operational variations for equipment operating under increased demand. The official dismissal of her warnings was particularly frustrating because Maria's military experience had included responsibility for maintaining forward operating bases under similar conditions of sustained high-demand operations. She had learned to recognize the subtle indicators that preceded cascade failures in complex systems, and she understood that safety margins designed for normal operations became inadequate when multiple stress factors combined during emergency conditions. Her training in explosive ordnance disposal had taught her to identify the chemical and thermal conditions that could trigger explosive reactions, knowledge that was directly applicable to the adhesive manufacturing processes that used peroxide-based compounds under high-temperature conditions. She recognized that the combination of increased production volumes, elevated operating temperatures, and deferred maintenance was creating exactly the conditions that led to chemical process accidents in industrial facilities. The parallel between her current situation and the circumstances that had preceded Operation Steel Guardian was becoming uncomfortably obvious. In both cases, she had identified genuine threats that were dismissed by authority figures who prioritized operational objectives over safety considerations. In both cases, official channels had proven inadequate for communicating urgent technical concerns to decision-makers who had the authority to implement corrective measures. The critical difference was that her military position had provided institutional mechanisms for documenting and escalating safety concerns, even when immediate supervisors disagreed with her assessments. Her civilian employment offered no equivalent protections for personnel who identified operational risks that conflicted with management priorities. She was completely dependent on the judgment and goodwill of supervisors who had already demonstrated their unwillingness to consider her technical expertise. Maria's sense of professional isolation had intensified as the emergency production schedule continued, and her warnings about systemic stress were consistently ignored. She found herself in the psychologically devastating position of watching preventable problems develop according to predictable patterns, while being powerless to influence the decisions that could prevent disaster. Her expertise had become a burden rather than an asset, creating knowledge of impending problems without providing any mechanism for acting on that knowledge. The psychological parallels to her military experience were creating internal conflicts that extended beyond workplace frustration to fundamental questions about her obligation to prevent disasters when she possessed specialized knowledge that others lacked. Her Medal of Honor citation had specifically recognized her willingness to accept personal risk in order to protect others, but her civilian employment had stripped away the authority and institutional support that made such actions possible. She began experiencing symptoms of stress that she recognized from her military service, including hypervigilance, sleep disruption, and intrusive thoughts about potential disaster scenarios. The combination of technical knowledge and institutional powerlessness was creating psychological pressure that she was struggling to manage through normal coping mechanisms. Her evening routine had expanded to include detailed analysis of industrial accident reports from facilities that had experienced the types of failures she was observing at Riverside Manufacturing. The research confirmed her worst fears about the trajectory that the facility was following. Multiple case studies documented situations where sustained overproduction had led to cascade failures that resulted in explosions, toxic releases, and worker fatalities. The incidents followed predictable patterns that began with deferred maintenance, continued with equipment stress under elevated operating conditions, and culminated in simultaneous failures of multiple safety systems that had been designed to operate independently. Maria's analysis indicated that Riverside Manufacturing was approaching the critical phase where minor equipment problems could trigger cascade reactions that would overwhelm the facility's emergency response capabilities. The combination of chemical inventory levels, equipment stress patterns, and reduced maintenance schedules was creating conditions similar to those that had preceded major industrial disasters at comparable facilities. Her documentation of potential failure scenarios had grown into a comprehensive risk assessment that identified 17 different ways that the current operating conditions could lead to catastrophic accidents. Each scenario was supported by technical analysis that drew on her military training in threat assessment and her research into industrial safety management. The reports represented professional quality engineering analysis that would have been taken seriously if they had come from someone with appropriate civilian credentials, but the reports remained in her personal files because she understood that presenting them through official channels would result in immediate termination for exceeding her assigned responsibilities and conducting unauthorized analysis of facility operations. Her technical expertise had become professionally dangerous, creating knowledge that she couldn't share without destroying her employment and eliminating any possibility of influencing safety decisions from within the organization. The isolation created by her unique knowledge base had been compounded by changes in her work assignment that further reduced her access to critical facility systems. Morrison had restricted her duties to external maintenance tasks that kept her away from production areas where her observations might identify problems that would require official responses from engineering personnel. She was effectively being prevented from gathering the information necessary to monitor safety conditions during the most dangerous period in the facility's operational history. Her attempts to maintain awareness of facility conditions required increasingly creative approaches to information gathering. She began arriving at work before her official shift to observe equipment startup procedures from public areas, and she used her lunch breaks to review system status displays that were visible from administrative offices. The covert monitoring was psychologically exhausting and provided only fragmentary information about overall facility conditions. The fragmentary data she could gather confirmed that equipment stress was continuing to increase as the emergency production schedule entered its fourth week. Temperature readings from systems she could observe were consistently elevated above normal ranges, and vibration patterns in rotating equipment indicated accelerated wear that would soon reach critical failure thresholds. The facility was operating in a degraded condition that masked serious problems behind the appearance of continued productivity. Maria's military experience had taught her to recognize the difference between apparent operational success and actual system reliability. Forward operating bases had often maintained mission effectiveness even when critical systems were approaching failure, but the temporary success created dangerous complacency that prevented proper preparation for inevitable breakdowns. Riverside Manufacturing was displaying similar patterns of degraded reliability disguised by continued production output. The most troubling aspect of her monitoring was the discovery that several safety systems were operating outside their design parameters without triggering automatic alarms or generating maintenance requests. The emergency cooling systems, chemical containment barriers, and fire suppression equipment were all showing signs of stress that indicated reduced effectiveness during the sustained, high-demand operations, but the degradation was occurring gradually enough to avoid detection by automated monitoring systems. Her analysis suggested that the facility's safety infrastructure was approaching a condition where multiple protective systems could fail simultaneously during an emergency, creating exactly the conditions that led to catastrophic industrial accidents. The same redundancy and fail-safe engineering that provided protection under normal operations could become inadequate when all systems were operating under stress and normal maintenance procedures had been deferred. Maria's research into comparable industrial accidents had revealed that facilities often experienced their worst disasters during periods of apparent operational success, when management confidence was highest and safety concerns were dismissed as unnecessary pessimism. The psychological dynamics that led to complacency during sustained productivity were identical to those she had observed at Riverside Manufacturing, where the emergency production schedule was being treated as evidence of operational excellence, rather than a dangerous stress test of facility capabilities. The combination of technical knowledge and institutional powerlessness had created a form of professional trauma that was affecting every aspect of Maria's life. She found herself unable to disconnect from work concerns during off hours, constantly analyzing facility operations and calculating failure probabilities based on the limited information she could gather. Her apartment had become a command center where she maintained detailed technical files that documented problems she couldn't officially report and solutions she couldn't officially implement. Her personal relationships had deteriorated as she withdrew from social activities that seemed trivial compared to the life and death safety issues she was monitoring at work. Friends and family members had begun expressing concern about her increasingly obsessive behavior and her inability to engage in normal conversations that didn't involve technical analysis or safety assessment. The gap between her professional knowledge and her personal isolation had become a source of psychological pressure that was affecting her mental and physical health. The approaching crisis had transformed Maria's expertise from a professional asset into a personal burden that she carried in complete isolation. She possessed the knowledge necessary to prevent a disaster that could claim hundreds of lives, but she lacked the institutional authority or credibility necessary to act on that knowledge. Her technical competence had become a source of psychological torture rather than professional satisfaction, creating awareness of preventable tragedy without providing any mechanism for prevention. The morning of September 15th arrived with conditions that Maria recognized as the perfect convergence of every risk factor she had been monitoring throughout the emergency production schedule. A late-season heat wave had pushed ambient temperatures to record levels, while humidity created atmospheric conditions that would stress the facility's overtaxed cooling systems beyond their breaking point. The weather forecast predicted sustained high temperatures with no relief expected for at least 72 hours, exactly the duration that Maria's calculations indicated would push multiple critical systems into simultaneous failure modes. She arrived at the facility before dawn to conduct her unofficial monitoring, immediately recognizing that overnight operations had created equipment stress patterns that indicated imminent system failures. The primary cooling circuits were operating at maximum capacity, while showing signs of reduced efficiency that suggested heat exchanger fouling and reduced coolant flow rates. Chemical processing lines were running at temperatures that approached the upper limits of safe operation for peroxide-based compounds, and the electrical systems were drawing power loads that exceeded design specifications for sustained operation. Maria's military training had taught her to recognize the specific combination of environmental conditions and operational stress that created cascade failure scenarios, and every indicator she could observe suggested that Riverside Manufacturing was approaching exactly that critical threshold. The facility was operating in a degraded condition where any additional stress factor could trigger multiple simultaneous failures that would overwhelm the emergency response capabilities of safety systems designed to handle individual equipment. Malfunctions. Her attempts to document the developing crisis were frustrated by her restricted access to diagnostic equipment and her limited authority to gather detailed technical data. She was reduced to observing symptoms from peripheral locations, while calculating failure probabilities based on fragmentary information that provided clear evidence of danger, but lacked the comprehensive detail necessary to support formal warnings. To management personnel. At 6:47 a.m., the first indication of system instability appeared when Chemical Processing Line 3 experienced an unexpected pressure spike that triggered automatic safety shutdowns designed to prevent equipment damage. The incident was classified as a routine malfunction by the shift supervisor, who attributed the pressure anomaly to normal variations in feedstock composition and ordered the line restarted according to standard procedures. Maria recognized that the pressure spike was actually a symptom of thermal instability in the chemical mixing process, indicating that reaction temperatures were approaching levels where additional heat generation could trigger runaway reactions. She attempted to approach the shift supervisor with her assessment of the pressure anomaly, but was immediately rebuffed with a reminder that maintenance personnel were not authorized to provide technical analysis of production processes. The supervisor's response made it clear that any further attempts to share her observations would be reported to management as insubordination and could result in immediate disciplinary action. By 8:15 a.m., 2 additional processing lines had experienced similar pressure anomalies, and Maria observed that operators were struggling to maintain stable reaction temperatures despite maximum cooling system operation. The pattern of instability was following exactly the progression that her research had identified in case studies of industrial accidents caused by sustained overproduction under high ambient temperature conditions. The facility was entering the critical phase where chemical processes could become uncontrollable despite operators following established procedures. Maria realized that the developing crisis required immediate action to prevent chemical reactions from escalating beyond the control capabilities of existing safety systems. Her military experience with explosive ordnance disposal had taught her to recognize the specific thermal and chemical conditions that preceded uncontrolled explosive reactions, and she identified multiple locations within the facility where those conditions were rapidly approaching critical thresholds. The most dangerous situation was developing in Building D's main production area, where storage tank 12 contained approximately 8,000 gallons of methyl ethyl ketone peroxide, compounds that were being processed at elevated temperatures under the emergency production schedule. Maria's analysis indicated that the combination of high ambient temperatures, overtaxed cooling systems, and increased production volumes was creating conditions where a thermal runaway could occur in the storage tank, resulting in an explosion that would destroy the entire building and potentially trigger secondary explosions in adjacent facilities. Her calculations suggested that the facility had approximately 90 minutes before thermal conditions in storage tank 12 would reach the critical point where automatic safety systems would be inadequate to prevent disaster. The emergency cooling systems were already operating at maximum capacity and showing signs of reduced effectiveness that indicated they would be unable to maintain safe temperatures if ambient conditions continued to deteriorate as predicted. By weather forecast. Maria understood that preventing the developing disaster required immediate implementation of emergency cooling procedures, evacuation of non-essential personnel from Building D, and coordination with local emergency responders who could provide supplemental cooling equipment and hazardous materials expertise. However, implementing these measures required authority that she didn't possess and credibility that her 18 months of professional marginalization had systematically destroyed. Her attempts to contact facility engineering through official channels were blocked by Frank Morrison, who informed her that emergency procedures could only be initiated by management personnel with appropriate authority and that maintenance workers were expected to continue their assigned duties unless specifically instructed otherwise. Morrison's response indicated that he interpreted her concerns as another example of the excessive anxiety that had characterized her performance evaluations. At 9:33 a.m., the crisis escalated dramatically when the primary cooling system serving Building D experienced a cascade failure that began with compressor overload and rapidly spread throughout the cooling circuit. The failure occurred exactly as Maria's analysis had predicted, during peak morning heat when production demands were highest, and the cooling system was operating with no reserve capacity to handle additional stress. The loss of primary cooling triggered automatic shutdown procedures for several chemical processing lines. But the shutdown sequence required nearly 15 minutes to complete, during which time temperatures in storage tank 12 continued to rise toward critical levels. Maria realized that the facility's emergency response procedures were inadequate for the specific failure mode that was developing, and that preventing disaster would require immediate manual intervention by personnel with specialized knowledge of chemical process safety. She attempted to contact the control room directly, but was informed that operational decisions were made by qualified engineering personnel and that maintenance workers were not authorized to provide technical recommendations. During emergency situations, the control room operator's response confirmed that facility management was relying on automated safety systems and standard emergency procedures that had been designed for individual equipment failures rather than the cascade scenario that was actually occurring. Maria watched through the reinforced windows of Building D as temperature readings on storage tank 12 continued to climb despite the activation of emergency cooling systems that were proving inadequate for the thermal loads they were facing. Her military training had included scenarios where conventional safety measures became ineffective during extreme conditions, requiring improvised solutions that drew on specialized technical knowledge and tactical thinking rather than established procedures. The developing situation required exactly the type of crisis leadership that had earned her the Medal of Honor during Operation Steel Guardian. When conventional defensive measures had proven inadequate against a coordinated enemy assault and she had been forced to implement improvised defensive strategies using her specialized knowledge of military tactics and facility security. The industrial crisis unfolding at Riverside Manufacturing demanded similar adaptability and willingness to act decisively, despite official resistance from authority figures who lacked the technical expertise necessary to understand the true scope of the emergency. Maria realized that she faced an impossible choice between following regulations that prohibited maintenance personnel from taking unauthorized action during emergencies and preventing a disaster that would claim hundreds of lives while destroying the surrounding industrial complex. Her 18 months of professional exile had prepared her for exactly this moment, when her specialized knowledge would become the only barrier between normal operations and catastrophic failure. The temperature readings from storage tank 12 indicated that thermal runaway was now inevitable unless immediate action was taken to implement emergency cooling measures that exceeded the capacity of automated safety systems. Maria's calculations suggested that she had less than 30 minutes to prevent an explosion that would kill everyone in Building D and potentially trigger secondary disasters throughout the industrial complex. Her military experience had taught her that leadership meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that affected every person under your command, even when taking action required violating established protocols and challenging authority figures who preferred procedure over results. The Medal of Honor citation that hung in her apartment had specifically recognized her willingness to risk personal consequences in order to protect others, but her civilian employment had created legal and professional constraints that made similar actions potentially criminal rather than heroic. Maria understood that attempting to prevent the developing disaster would immediately end her civilian career and could result in federal charges for interfering with industrial operations without proper authorization. The security cameras throughout the facility would document every action she took, providing evidence that could be used to prosecute her for violating regulations designed to prevent unauthorized personnel from accessing critical safety systems. But the alternative was watching 400 workers die in an explosion that she possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to prevent. Her specialized training in explosive ordnance disposal, chemical weapons defense, and emergency response coordination represented exactly the expertise needed to implement the improvised cooling measures that could prevent thermal runaway in Storage Tank 12. The parallels to Operation Steel Guardian were becoming overwhelmingly obvious as Maria realized that she was once again facing a situation where conventional safety measures were proving inadequate and preventing disaster. Required someone with specialized knowledge to implement solutions that existed outside established procedures. The difference was that her military position had provided institutional authority to act on her technical judgment, while her civilian employment had stripped away every mechanism that could legitimate emergency action based on expert assessment. Maria's hands trembled as she calculated the precise sequence of actions necessary to prevent the explosion while minimizing her exposure to chemical hazards and security responses. Her military training provided detailed knowledge of emergency cooling techniques that could be implemented using equipment available in the facility's maintenance areas. But accessing Storage Tank 12 would require her to violate multiple security protocols and override safety systems that were designed to prevent unauthorized personnel from approaching hazardous chemical storage areas. The psychological weight of choosing between personal safety and collective disaster was identical to the decision-making process that had defined her military service. But the institutional context had changed in ways that transformed heroic action into criminal behavior. She would be preventing a tragedy that official personnel couldn't see coming, but she would be doing so without legal authority and in direct violation of regulations that carried severe penalties for unauthorized emergency response activities. The reinforced windows of Building D. Maria could see maintenance workers and production personnel continuing their assigned duties, unaware that they were working directly above a chemical storage tank that was approaching explosive conditions. The facility's emergency notification systems had not been activated because automated monitoring equipment was indicating that all safety parameters remained within acceptable ranges, despite the cascade failure that was actually occurring in real time. Maria realized that the 400 people whose lives depended on her decision would never know that disaster had been prevented, just as they had never acknowledged the 18 months of accurate warnings that had preceded this crisis. Her choice was between allowing preventable deaths to occur or accepting personal destruction in order to save people who had systematically dismissed her expertise and marginalized her professional contributions. The temperature readings from Storage Tank 12 showed continued escalation toward the critical threshold where thermal runaway would become irreversible, leaving Maria with less than 20 minutes to decide whether her obligation to prevent disaster outweighed her commitment to legal compliance and personal survival. Maria stood frozen in the maintenance corridor, her body trembling not from fear, but from the crushing weight of déjà vu that transported her back to the forward operating base, where she had faced an identical choice between institutional compliance and moral obligation. The image of Storage Tank 12's rising temperature displays merged with memories of Operation Steel Guardian, where her warnings about enemy surveillance had been dismissed until the attack materialized, exactly as she had predicted. Her mind flashed back to Colonel Patterson's voice, echoing across the Afghan desert. "Your concerns are noted, Staff Sergeant, but operations will proceed according to established protocols." The dismissive tone was identical to every conversation she had endured at Riverside Manufacturing, where her technical expertise had been systematically devalued by supervisors who prioritized procedural compliance over accurate threat assessment. The radio clipped to her maintenance belt felt impossibly heavy as Maria calculated the precise sequence of actions necessary to prevent the thermal runaway that would kill 400 innocent people. She knew that accessing the emergency cooling controls for Storage Tank 12 would require her to violate multiple security protocols, override automated safety systems, and directly contravene federal regulations that prohibited unauthorized personnel from interfering with chemical processing operations. Her 18 months of professional exile had taught her that expertise without institutional authority was worthless, that being consistently correct about technical assessments meant nothing if you lacked the proper credentials to be heard by decision-makers. She had spent every day since her arrival at Riverside manufacturing learning that the civilian workplace punished competence that exceeded organizational boundaries, that speaking uncomfortable truths to authority figures resulted in marginalization rather than recognition. The temperature readings visible through the control room windows showed storage tank 12 approaching 165 degrees Fahrenheit, only 15 degrees below the threshold where methyl ethyl ketone peroxide compounds would begin the irreversible chemical cascade that led to explosive decomposition. Maria's military training had included extensive study of industrial explosions involving similar compounds, and she understood that the blast radius would extend far beyond Building D to encompass the entire manufacturing complex and surrounding residential areas. Her calculations indicated that she had approximately 18 minutes to implement emergency cooling measures that could prevent the explosion, but accessing the necessary controls would require her to enter restricted areas where security cameras would document every action she took. The footage would provide irrefutable evidence of unauthorized access to critical safety systems, evidence that could be used to prosecute her for federal crimes that carried sentences of up to 20 years in prison. But the alternative was watching 400 people die in an explosion that she possessed the knowledge and capability to prevent. Her Medal of Honor citation had specifically recognized her willingness to risk personal consequences in order to protect others. Her demonstrated commitment to placing the welfare of her fellow service members above considerations of personal safety or career advancement. The values that had defined her military service demanded that she act to prevent preventable tragedy, regardless of the personal cost. Maria thought about the families who would lose loved ones if she chose compliance over action, the children who would grow up without parents, the spouses who would spend the rest of their lives wondering whether the explosion could have been prevented if someone with the right knowledge had been willing to act. She thought about the surviving workers who would carry psychological scars from witnessing the deaths of their colleagues, and the community members whose lives would be permanently altered by a disaster that official investigations would later classify as unforeseeable. Through the windows of Building D, she could see production workers continuing their assignments, unaware that they were operating directly above a chemical storage system that was approaching catastrophic failure. Their trust in the facility's safety systems and management expertise was absolute, based on the reasonable assumption that industrial operations were conducted according to rigorous safety standards that protected workers from preventable hazards. None of them knew that the woman emptying trash bins and checking equipment had the specialized knowledge necessary to recognize and prevent the disaster that was developing beneath their feet. They had dismissed her warnings for 18 months, treating her as an overly anxious maintenance worker whose technical observations were irrelevant to their professional responsibilities. Their survival now depended on someone they had never taken seriously, taking action that would destroy her own future. Maria's radio crackled with routine maintenance communications as her colleagues continued their assigned duties, oblivious to the crisis that was unfolding in real time. The normal operational chatter created a surreal contrast to the life and death decision she was facing, highlighting the gap between apparent normalcy and actual emergency conditions that characterized the moments before industrial disasters. She keyed her radio and attempted one final effort to communicate the emergency through official channels, knowing that the attempt would fail but needing to document that she had exhausted proper procedures before taking unauthorized action. Control room, this is Santos in Building D maintenance. We have critical temperature readings in storage tank 12 that require immediate emergency response. The tank is approaching thermal runaway conditions that could result in explosive failure. The control room operator's response carried the dismissive tone that had become familiar over 18 months of ignored warnings. Santos, all monitoring systems show normal parameters. You're not authorized to interpret chemical process data. Return to your assigned duties and discontinue unauthorized radio communications on operational frequencies. Maria tried again, this time using the technical terminology that might penetrate the operator's indifference. Control room, storage tank 12 is currently reading 166 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. Methyl ethyl ketone peroxide compounds become unstable at 180 degrees. We have less than 15 minutes before thermal runaway becomes irreversible. This is an actual emergency requiring immediate evacuation and emergency cooling implementation. Santos, you are ordered to cease unauthorized technical analysis and report to your supervisor immediately for disciplinary action. Any further disruption of operational communications will result in security intervention and immediate termination. The operator's final transmission made it clear that official channels had been permanently closed, that her warnings would not be heard or acted upon regardless of their accuracy or urgency. Maria realized that the institutional dynamics that had marginalized her expertise for 18 months were now preventing her from saving lives through legitimate procedures. The same organizational hierarchy that had dismissed her technical assessments as inappropriate overreach was now blocking her final attempt to prevent disaster through proper channels. She had exhausted every official option and was left with the choice between unauthorized action and preventable catastrophe. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Her military experience had taught her that leadership meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that extended beyond personal consequences, that protecting others sometimes required violating regulations that prioritized institutional authority over human welfare. Operation Steel Guardian had established the precedent where her willingness to act, despite official orders, had prevented a military disaster, but her court-martial proceedings had made it clear that such actions carried severe professional and legal consequences. The difference was that her military service had been governed by codes of conduct that ultimately valued mission success and protection of personnel over rigid adherence to procedural compliance. The civilian workplace operated according to legal frameworks that made unauthorized emergency action a criminal offense regardless of its necessity or effectiveness in preventing harm to others. Maria checked the temperature readings one final time and saw that storage tank 12 had reached 168 degrees Fahrenheit with continued escalation that indicated thermal runaway would begin within 12 minutes. The automated safety systems were proving inadequate for the specific failure mode that was occurring, and manual intervention was the only remaining option for preventing an explosion that would rank among the worst industrial disasters in American history. She removed her radio and placed it carefully on the maintenance cart, understanding that her next actions would end her civilian career and likely result in federal prosecution. But 400 lives depended on someone with specialized knowledge taking action that no one else could or would take. Her Medal of Honor had been awarded for exactly this type of decision, where personal sacrifice was necessary to prevent tragedy that others couldn't see coming. Maria began moving toward the restricted access door that led to storage tank 12's emergency cooling controls, her military training taking over as she calculated approach routes, security camera angles, and the precise sequence of technical procedures necessary to implement manual cooling measures. The skills that had kept her Marines alive during combat operations were now being applied to preventing an industrial disaster that official personnel had failed to recognize or address. Her hands remained steady as she approached the biometric scanner that controlled access to the chemical storage area, knowing that using her maintenance credentials to gain unauthorized entry would create an electronic record of her violation that could never be disputed or explained away. The security system would log her access attempt and trigger automatic notifications to facility management and local law enforcement agencies. But storage tank 12's temperature had reached 170 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving her with less than 10 minutes to prevent thermal runaway that would kill everyone in Building D and potentially trigger secondary explosions throughout the manufacturing complex. Her specialized knowledge of emergency cooling procedures represented the only remaining barrier between normal operations and catastrophic failure. Maria placed her palm on the biometric scanner and spoke her access code. Hearing the electronic locks disengage as the security system granted her entry to the restricted area, where Storage Tank 12's emergency controls were located. The action violated multiple federal regulations and facility security protocols, creating irrefutable evidence of unauthorized access that would be used to prosecute her for interfering with critical infrastructure operations. She moved through the chemical storage area with the methodical precision of someone whose military training had included emergency response under extreme pressure, identifying the manual cooling controls and calculating the optimal sequence for implementing emergency thermal management measures. The specialized knowledge that had been dismissed as irrelevant for 18 months was now being applied to prevent a disaster that would have national implications for industrial safety regulation and emergency response procedures. The temperature readings from Storage Tank 12 showed continued escalation toward the critical threshold, confirming that automated safety systems had failed to control the thermal runaway that was developing despite their continued operation according to design specifications. Maria's intervention represented the final opportunity to prevent an explosion that would occur regardless of continued reliance on conventional safety measures that had proven inadequate for the specific conditions that existed. Her military experience with improvised explosive devices had taught her to recognize the precise thermal conditions that preceded uncontrolled chemical reactions, and she understood that Storage Tank 12 was approaching the point where even perfect emergency cooling implementation might be insufficient to prevent disaster. The margin for error had essentially disappeared, leaving only immediate manual intervention as a viable option for preventing catastrophic failure. Maria reached the emergency cooling controls and began implementing the technical procedures that her specialized training had taught her, knowing that every action was being recorded by security cameras that would provide evidence for her eventual prosecution. But 400 innocent people were depending on someone with the knowledge and courage necessary to act. When official channels had failed to recognize or respond to an actual emergency. As she initiated the emergency cooling sequence, Maria thought about the irony that her career would end with her finally being allowed to use her expertise to its fullest extent, but only by violating every regulation that had prevented her from contributing her specialized knowledge through legitimate channels. Her professional destruction was the price of preventing a tragedy that no one else had the capability to see coming or the technical skills necessary to prevent. Maria's fingers moved across the emergency cooling controls with the practiced precision of someone whose military training had included countless hours of crisis response under extreme pressure. Her specialized knowledge of thermal management systems guided her through the complex sequence of manual overrides necessary to bypass the automated systems that had proven inadequate for the specific failure mode occurring in Storage Tank 12. First phase of her emergency intervention involved redirecting coolant flow from 3 adjacent storage systems to concentrate maximum thermal management capacity on the tank that was approaching critical temperature. The procedure required precise timing and thorough understanding of the facility's cooling infrastructure, knowledge that she had acquired through 18 months of careful observation, despite being systematically excluded from technical training and system documentation. As she implemented the coolant redirection sequence, alarms began sounding throughout Building D as automated monitoring systems detected the unauthorized modifications to cooling system operations. The facility's security protocols immediately initiated lockdown procedures designed to prevent tampering with critical infrastructure. But Maria's military training had taught her to anticipate and work around security measures that could interfere with emergency response operations. Her radio crackled with increasingly urgent communications as facility management attempted to understand why multiple safety systems were registering unauthorized modifications to chemical storage operations. Security to Building D. We have multiple breach indicators in the chemical storage area. All personnel are ordered to evacuate immediately pending security assessment, announced the facility security coordinator, his voice carrying the tension of someone confronting an unprecedented emergency. Maria ignored the evacuation order and continued implementing emergency cooling measures, knowing that abandoning her position would guarantee the thermal runaway that would kill everyone she was trying to save. Storage Tank 12's temperature had reached 174 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving her with less than 6 minutes before chemical decomposition became irreversible regardless of any cooling measures that could be implemented. Through the reinforced windows of the storage area, she could see security personnel approaching with weapons drawn, their training having prepared them to respond to sabotage attempts and unauthorized access to critical systems but not to emergency interventions by personnel with specialized technical knowledge. The approaching security team represented an immediate threat to her ability to complete the cooling sequence that was the only remaining option for preventing disaster. "This is facility security," announced a voice through the external speaker system. "The individual in Storage Area 12 is ordered to cease all activity and surrender immediately. You are in violation of federal regulations governing critical infrastructure security." Maria realized that the security response was following protocols designed to protect against external threats rather than addressing the actual emergency that was developing within the facility's own operations. She activated her maintenance radio one final time, knowing that her transmission would be recorded and could be used as evidence during her eventual prosecution. "Control room, this is Santos. Storage Tank 12 is at 175 degrees and approaching thermal runaway. I am implementing emergency cooling measures to prevent explosive failure. Do not interfere with these procedures or 400 people will die." The control room operator's response reflected the confusion of someone trying to reconcile Maria's technical expertise with her official status as unauthorized personnel. "Santos, you are ordered to cease all activity immediately. Security personnel are responding to your location. Any resistance will result in use of force." The transmission confirmed that facility management was treating her emergency intervention as a security threat rather than a life-saving operation. Maria continued working through the complex cooling sequence while calculating how much time she had before security personnel would forcibly remove her from the controls. Her military experience had included training in completing critical tasks under hostile conditions, but the approaching security team represented a unique challenge because they were trying to protect the facility by preventing exactly the actions that were necessary to save it. The second phase of her emergency procedure involved activating auxiliary cooling systems that were normally reserved for catastrophic failures but had never been tested under the specific conditions that existed in Storage Tank 12. The auxiliary systems required manual activation from multiple control points, forcing Maria to move rapidly between different locations while maintaining precise timing that would maximize cooling effectiveness. As she moved to the secondary control station, security personnel breached the storage area entrance and began advancing toward her position with weapons trained on her location. "Drop what you're doing and put your hands where we can see them," shouted the lead security officer, his training having taught him to establish immediate control over unauthorized personnel who had accessed restricted areas. "I'm preventing an explosion that will kill everyone in this building," Maria replied without stopping her work on the cooling controls. "Storage Tank 12 is approaching thermal runaway. If you stop me now, we'll all be dead in 4 minutes." Her voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to maintaining operational focus. During life-threatening emergencies, the security officer hesitated, clearly unprepared for a situation where the unauthorized intruder was claiming to be preventing rather than causing a disaster. His training had not included scenarios where maintenance personnel might possess specialized knowledge that exceeded the expertise of facility management, and Maria's technical explanations conflicted with his understanding of proper emergency response procedures. Control room, we have the subject contained, but she's claiming to be preventing some kind of explosion. The security officer transmitted, seeking guidance from supervisors who were equally unprepared for the situation they were confronting. She's operating cooling system controls and says the facility is in immediate danger. Plant manager Robert Hendricks, voice crackled through the security radio with the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to making decisive operational decisions. Security team, remove the individual immediately and secure all affected systems. Whatever she's done to our equipment needs to be reversed by qualified personnel who understand proper safety protocols. Maria realized that Hendricks was about to order actions that would guarantee the explosion she was trying to prevent, and that she had seconds to complete the cooling sequence before security personnel would forcibly remove her from the controls. Storage tank 12's temperature had reached 177 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving approximately 3 minutes before thermal runaway would become irreversible. She activated the final phase of emergency, cooling while speaking directly to the security officers who were approaching her position. I'm a former Marine with specialized training in explosive ordnance disposal and chemical weapons defense. Storage tank 12 contains 8,000 gallons of methyl ethyl ketone peroxide that becomes explosive at 180 degrees. We're currently at 177 degrees and climbing. If you stop me from completing this cooling sequence, everyone in this building will be dead in less than 3 minutes. The lead security officer paused, recognizing the authority in Maria's voice and the technical precision of her explanation. His military experience had taught him to recognize genuine expertise under pressure, and everything about Maria's demeanor indicated someone with actual knowledge of the situation rather than an individual engaged in sabotage or unauthorized experimentation. Control room, the subject claims to have military explosive ordnance training and says we're facing imminent explosion from one of the chemical storage tanks. He transmitted, requesting clarification from supervisors who would have to take responsibility for whatever decision was made in the next 60 seconds. Hendricks' response carried the frustration of someone confronting a situation that challenged his understanding of facility operations and personnel capabilities. Security team, that individual is a maintenance worker with no technical qualifications. Remove her immediately and let our engineers assess whatever damage she's caused to our systems. The temperature reading on storage tank 12 reached 178 degrees Fahrenheit as Maria completed the emergency cooling sequence, implementing thermal management measures that represented the maximum cooling capacity available within the facility's infrastructure. The specialized procedures she had executed were based on military training in preventing thermal runaway in chemical storage systems, knowledge that was directly applicable to civilian industrial operations but had never been officially recognized or utilized. 2 minutes until thermal runaway becomes irreversible, Maria announced to the security team, her voice carrying the calm precision of someone who had calculated disaster timelines during multiple combat deployments. The emergency cooling is now active, but it needs 90 seconds of uninterrupted operation to reduce tank temperature below critical thresholds. The security officers found themselves in an unprecedented situation where their orders to remove unauthorized personnel conflicted with technical warnings from someone who demonstrated obvious expertise in the emergency they were supposedly facing. Their military training had taught them to recognize competent leadership under extreme conditions, and Maria's behavior was consistent with someone taking necessary action rather than someone engaged in destructive activity. Through the facility's external speaker system, Hendricks' voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his decisions followed without question. "Security team, you are ordered to remove the individual immediately. Every second she remains at those controls represents additional risk to facility operations and personnel safety." The lead security officer made the decision that would determine whether Maria's emergency intervention succeeded or failed. "Control room, we're going to maintain position and monitor the situation for 90 seconds. If her cooling procedure works, we'll know she was telling the truth. If it doesn't work, we'll have our answer about whether she was helping or hurting." Maria watched the temperature readings from Storage Tank 12 with the focused attention of someone whose military experience had included multiple situations where success or failure was measured in degrees of temperature or seconds of timing. The emergency cooling systems were operating at maximum capacity, but the thermal mass of 8,000 gallons of chemical compounds meant that temperature reduction would occur gradually rather than immediately. At 179 degrees Fahrenheit, Storage Tank 12 reached the highest temperature recorded in the facility's operational history, approaching the critical threshold where methyl ethyl ketone peroxide would begin irreversible decomposition that would lead to explosive failure within seconds. Maria's emergency cooling measures were representing the absolute final opportunity to prevent a disaster that would rank among the worst industrial accidents in American history. The temperature gauge showed the first indication of thermal stabilization. As the emergency cooling systems began to overcome the heat generation that had been driving the tank toward explosive failure, the reading dropped to 178.8 degrees, then to 178.5 degrees, indicating that Maria's intervention was successfully preventing the thermal runaway that had seemed inevitable only minutes earlier. "Temperature is stabilizing," Maria announced to the security team, her voice carrying the relief of someone who had successfully prevented a catastrophe that would have claimed hundreds of lives. "The emergency cooling is working. Tank temperature is dropping below critical thresholds." The control room operator's voice crackled through the facility communication system with obvious confusion as automated. Monitoring systems began registering the temperature reduction that Maria's manual intervention had achieved. "We're showing temperature reduction in Storage Tank 12. How is this possible when our automated systems indicated normal operating parameters throughout this entire incident?" Plant Manager Hendricks arrived at the storage area entrance, accompanied by Chief Engineer Dale Thompson and several other management personnel who had been summoned to assess the situation that had developed without their knowledge or authorization. Their expressions reflected the bewilderment of people confronting evidence that challenged their understanding of both facility operations and personnel capabilities. "What exactly has happened here?" Hendricks demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to receiving immediate explanations for any unusual events affecting facility operations. "Our monitoring systems show that Storage Tank 12 experienced temperature fluctuations, but nothing that should have required emergency intervention." Maria stepped away from the cooling controls, knowing that her unauthorized access to restricted systems had been documented by multiple security cameras and would result in immediate termination and likely federal prosecution. But Storage Tank 12's temperature had dropped to 176 degrees and was continuing to decline as the emergency cooling systems maintained thermal control that prevented explosive failure. "Your automated monitoring systems weren't detecting the thermal runaway that was developing in Storage Tank 12. Maria explained with the calm professionalism of someone providing a technical briefing. The combination of emergency production schedules, equipment stress, and elevated ambient temperatures created conditions where chemical decomposition would have occurred despite normal safety system operation. Thompson examined the cooling system displays with growing amazement as he realized that Maria had implemented thermal management procedures that exceeded the technical knowledge of most industrial engineers. "These cooling modifications are incredibly sophisticated," he admitted reluctantly. "How did you know how to implement emergency thermal control measures that aren't covered in any of our operational procedures?" Maria's response would finally reveal the expertise that had been hidden beneath 18 months of professional marginalization and systematic dismissal by facility management personnel who had evaluated her based on job title rather than actual qualifications. Maria stood surrounded by security personnel and facility management, her maintenance uniform soaked with perspiration from the stress of preventing a disaster that would have claimed hundreds of lives. Storage Tank 12's temperature display showed 174 degrees and continuing to decline as the emergency cooling systems maintained the thermal control that her unauthorized intervention had achieved. The silence in the chemical storage area was broken only by the hum of cooling equipment and the distant sound of production operations that continued throughout the facility, their operators still unaware of how close they had come to catastrophic death. Plant manager Robert Hendricks stared at Maria with a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion that challenged everything he thought he understood about personnel capabilities and facility operations. The technical sophistication of her emergency intervention far exceeded anything he had witnessed from certified engineers with advanced degrees and decades of industrial experience. Her precise manipulation of complex cooling systems suggested knowledge that should have been impossible for someone whose official qualifications included only basic maintenance training. "Ms. Santos, I need you to explain exactly how you knew how to implement these emergency procedures," Hendricks said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to receiving immediate answers to questions that affected facility operations. "The technical modifications you've made to our cooling systems represent engineering expertise that goes far beyond anything covered in maintenance training or standard safety protocols." Maria realized that the moment had arrived when her 18 months of professional exile would finally end, but not in the way she had ever imagined. Her attempts to hide her military credentials had become impossible to maintain now that she had demonstrated knowledge that could only have come from specialized training in chemical weapons defense and explosive ordnance disposal. The emergency intervention that had saved 400 lives would also reveal the expertise that she had been forced to conceal. She reached into her wallet and produced the military identification card that she had carried but never shown to anyone at Riverside Manufacturing during her entire employment. Plant manager Hendricks examined the card with growing amazement as he read credentials that identified her as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Marine Corps, with specialized certifications in explosive ordnance disposal, chemical weapons defense, and industrial facility protection. "You're not a maintenance worker," Chief Engineer Dale Thompson said quietly, the implications of Maria's revealed credentials beginning to register with shocking clarity. "You're a military specialist with training in exactly the type of emergency we just experienced." Maria nodded, her voice carrying the weight of 18 months spent hiding qualifications that were directly relevant to every safety concern she had raised and every technical assessment that had been dismissed by supervisory personnel. "I'm a former Marine with 12 years of experience in protecting critical infrastructure from chemical weapons attacks, industrial sabotage, and explosive threats. My specialty was threat assessment and emergency response for facilities that processed hazardous materials under combat conditions." The revelation transformed every interaction that facility management had experienced with Maria over the previous 18 months, recontextualizing her persistent safety warnings and technical observations as professional assessments rather than the anxious concerns of an overzealous maintenance worker. Hendricks realized that his organization had been systematically ignoring expertise that exceeded the qualifications of most civilian industrial safety specialists. "The cooling system warnings in July," Thompson said slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place with uncomfortable clarity. "You predicted the exact failure mode that occurred during the peak production period, and the chemical storage tank corrosion that we attributed to normal wear. You identified stress patterns that indicated structural failure weeks before it happened." Maria confirmed his growing understanding with the calm professionalism of someone who had learned not to expect recognition for technical competence that challenged organizational assumptions. "I've been documenting safety vulnerabilities and operational risks since my first week of employment. My military training taught me to recognize the warning signs that indicate potential cascade failures in complex industrial systems." Security Chief Marcus Webb approached Maria with obvious embarrassment as he realized that his team had nearly prevented her from completing emergency procedures that had saved the entire facility from catastrophic destruction. "Ma'am, I need to apologize for the way we responded to your emergency intervention. Our protocols don't include scenarios where unauthorized personnel might possess specialized knowledge that exceeds our technical staff capabilities." The facility's emergency communication system crackled with transmissions from local fire departments and hazardous materials response teams, who had been alerted by automated monitoring systems that detected the unauthorized modifications to chemical storage operations. Emergency responders were arriving at the facility, prepared to address what they assumed was a security breach or sabotage attempt rather than a successful disaster prevention operation. Hendricks contacted the emergency response coordinator to explain that the incident had been resolved through internal emergency procedures, but the conversation revealed his growing understanding that Maria's intervention had prevented what could have been the deadliest industrial accident in regional history. The magnitude of the disaster she had prevented was becoming clear as he calculated the potential casualties and property damage that would have resulted from an explosion involving 8,000 gallons of methyl ethyl ketone peroxide. "Staff, Sergeant Santos," Hendricks said, using her military rank for the first time since her employment began, "I need you to help me understand what happened here today and why our normal safety systems were inadequate for the emergency you identified." Maria's explanation revealed the technical sophistication of her analysis and the comprehensive understanding of industrial safety that her military training had provided. She described how the combination of emergency production schedules, equipment, stress, and environmental conditions had created a cascade failure scenario that exceeded the design parameters of automated safety systems. Her intervention had been necessary because conventional emergency procedures were inadequate for the specific thermal runaway conditions that had developed in storage. Tank 12. As Maria detailed her technical assessment, the management personnel, who had dismissed her warnings for 18 months, began to understand the magnitude of their collective failure to recognize and utilize her expertise. Every safety concern she had raised, every equipment problem she had identified, and every operational risk she had documented had been based on professional knowledge that far exceeded the qualifications of most civilian industrial specialists. Chief Engineer Thompson requested copies of the technical reports that Maria had submitted through official channels, wanting to review the documentation that had been dismissed as the uninformed observations of someone who exceeded her assigned responsibilities. His examination of her detailed analysis revealed engineering expertise that would have prevented multiple equipment failures and operational disruptions if it had been taken seriously by facility management. The transformation in how facility personnel viewed Maria was immediate and comprehensive. The woman they had marginalized as an overly anxious maintenance worker was revealed as someone whose technical knowledge and crisis response capabilities exceeded those of most professionals they had encountered in civilian industrial operations. Her expertise represented exactly the type of specialized knowledge that could have prevented numerous safety incidents and operational problems throughout her employment. Hendricks realized that his organization's systematic dismissal of Maria's expertise had not only wasted 18 months of valuable technical contributions, but had also created conditions where a catastrophic disaster was only prevented through unauthorized emergency action that violated multiple federal regulations. The institutional bias that had prevented recognition of her qualifications had nearly resulted in the worst industrial accident in company history. Staff Sergeant Santos, I owe you an apology on behalf of this entire organization, Hendricks said with the gravity of someone acknowledging a failure that could have resulted in hundreds of deaths. Your technical expertise could have prevented this emergency if we had recognized and utilized your qualifications, instead of limiting you to maintenance duties that didn't require your specialized knowledge. But Maria understood that individual acknowledgement, while personally meaningful, wouldn't address the systematic problems that had prevented her expertise from being recognized and utilized through legitimate channels. The institutional dynamics that had marginalized her technical contributions were symptoms of broader organizational issues that affected how companies identified and developed talent among personnel whose qualifications didn't fit traditional hiring and advancement criteria. Within 72 hours of preventing the industrial disaster, Maria's life underwent a transformation that exceeded anything she could have imagined during her 18 months of professional exile. The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched a comprehensive review of her emergency intervention, ultimately concluding that her actions had prevented what would have been classified as a weapons of mass destruction incident due to the scale of potential casualties and environmental damage. Secretary of Labor Patricia Williams personally visited Riverside Manufacturing to present Maria with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for civilian heroism, recognizing her courage in risking federal prosecution to save 400 lives. The ceremony was attended by military officials who had reviewed her service record and recommended her for immediate reinstatement at the rank of gunnery sergeant, with assignment to the Marine Corps' Industrial Safety Command. But Maria chose a different path. She accepted the position of Director of Industrial Safety for the Department of Homeland Security, creating the Veterans Expertise Recognition Program that identified and utilized military specialists working in civilian roles, where their specialized knowledge could enhance national security and public safety. Her first initiative established rapid response teams staffed by veterans with technical specialties relevant to critical infrastructure protection. Riverside Manufacturing implemented comprehensive safety reforms based on Maria's recommendations, while dozens of other companies requested her consultation services to identify hidden expertise among their personnel. The maintenance worker who had been dismissed as overly anxious became the leading authority on recognizing and developing technical talent in unexpected places. 6 months later, Maria testified before Congress about the importance of utilizing veteran expertise in civilian critical infrastructure, her Medal of Honor visible on her uniform as she explained how institutional bias had nearly resulted in catastrophic loss of life. Have you ever witnessed someone's hidden talents being overlooked in your workplace? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people whose extraordinary skills saved lives when it mattered most. Hit that notification bell to never miss these inspiring tales of courage, determination, and the power of recognizing expertise wherever it's found.